Welcome back to Occult Archives. You know the deal. We dig into the hidden stories behind history's most notorious books.
Right, the books that people talked about in hushed tones, sometimes maybe even a little afraid of the knowledge tucked away inside.
Yeah, exactly. And today, we're taking on, well, one that's definitely got its share of whispers, The Golden Chain of Homer.
This one's got a subtitle that kind of grabs you right away, too. Nature's Secret Fire and the Universal Spirit.
Nature's Secret Fire, huh? Sounds intense.
It is. And the book really lives up to it. It's all about uncovering, like, the core principles of how everything works, the universe and all that.
So not just some old theories, but a deep dive into, like, the very essence of reality.
Exactly. The Golden Chain of Homer says there's this single principle, this one thing, that underlies everything in existence.
It's like a common thread running through everything,
Yeah.
from a tiny pebble to the entire galaxy.
You got it. They describe it as a kind of universal fire, or Anima Mundi, like a soul of the world.
Now, when we hear universal fire, we're not talking about, like, flames and stuff.
Right. It's more about a kind of foundational energy, this principle that's everywhere, all throughout the universe. They call it the universal agent, something that's omnipresent, always acting with this unerring instinct, almost like it's got its own intelligence.
The universe has an instinct. That's a big one to wrap your head around. So how does this instinct play out in the world?
Well, the Golden Chain of Homer says this fire mostly shows up as, well, fire and light, and it calls it the first creature of divine omnipotence, which means it was the first thing to come into existence, like the source of everything else.
Okay, so there's this energy, this source. But how does all the variety we see in the world, everything we experience, come from just that one thing? Chapter 2 is titled, How All Things Proceed Therefrom, so I guess that's where we find out.
Right. The book talks about three main states, or ways that the spirit or fire manifests. First, there's this totally invisible, like immaterial state, cold, not taking up any space. It's everywhere, but in this form, it's not really doing much, of no use to us, as the text says. Pure potential, I guess you could say.
Like a seed before it sprouts. It has the potential to be a plant, but it's just sitting there.
Perfect analogy. Then there's the second state. When this fire somehow gets stirred up, put into motion, it becomes light. They even connect this to that whole creation story, light separating from chaos, let there be light, and all that. But even this light is described as being cold, which is interesting.
Cold light, that doesn't really jive with our usual experience.
Right. The warmth comes in the third state. When this light is gathered together, a bunch of it, and it's really agitated, that's when it becomes what we know as burning fire. That gives us both light and heat. This is where it gets a little more physical, taking up space, becoming somewhat material, as they put it, but it's not a permanent thing. If the agitation stops or if it runs out of fuel, it goes back to that first state of just being everywhere but not really doing anything.
So one energy, three states. Invisible potential, cold light, and then fire with heat and a bit of physicality. But the book also talks about these occult powers of the universal spirit.
Oh yeah, beyond those three states, there's these two fundamental powers, attracting and repulsing. And it really emphasizes how strong these forces are.
We're talking like courses of nature on a huge scale, like the examples they give. Thunder, lightning, earthquakes, hurricanes, even gunpowder.
Exactly. All these massive events, both natural ones and ones we make ourselves, are seen as coming from those attracting and repulsing powers within the universal spirit. It's like the driving force behind the visible world.
Okay, but how does this universal fire, that's, spirit and light, turn into the actual physical things we touch, like water, earth?
Good question. The text says this fire can transform into material forms: vapor, humidity, water, then earth. But through it all, it keeps its essential nature, even as it changes. Kind of like how water can be ice, liquid, or steam, but it's always HO.
So the four elements, fire, air, water, earth, all come from this single fire in the beginning.
That's what they say. First, burning fire. Then vapor or humidity, when it gets mixed with this cold fire, becomes air. That air gets more condensed and turns into water. And finally, the water gets thicker. Inspicisated is the word they use, and becomes earth. So from one, you get four, all through different ways of the fire interacting with itself.
From 1 to 4. And then there's this special emphasis on light and water in the creation story, right?
Right. They say light got separated from this chaotic mass of water, which was itself already a condensed form of the universal fire. So in a way, everything is born from that interaction of light and water. Water is like the first step towards the fire becoming something we can touch. It still has that fiery nature at its heart. And light, it's the essential partner in this whole creation thing.
So where do air and water, as we know them, fit into this picture of fire and humidity?
Well, air is described as basically water that's been thinned out, rarefied is the term, and where the fire is more dominant. Humid water, on the other hand, is water that's been condensed and the water aspect is more pronounced. But both of them, air and water, are hiding that central fire, that universal spirit inside them.
Like a hidden engine powering everything almost. But what happens when things decay, like when plants or animals break down? There's that whole concept of putrefaction in the book, right?
Yeah, putrefaction is what happens when air or water gets cut off from that universal fire, the animated air that keeps things alive. It loses its energy, its movement, and starts going downhill, turning back into humidity, mud, or just plain earth.
So when the spirit leaves, you get physical decay. It's like a consistent theme.
Mm,
And humidity, or water, seems to be the key ingredient in all these
you
transformations.
got it. They call humidity or water the body, vehicle, and tool of all these natural processes, while the spirit or fire is the operator, the one doing the work.
Then there's this universal acid that shows up in the text. That sounds pretty powerful, maybe a bit scary.
Yeah, a little intimidating.
Yeah.
The book says that the universal fire, filling the vast spaces between stars and planets, creates this subtle vapor, or really invisible subtle humidity. And from this, you get a kind of gentle universal fermentation going on. That's what creates this universe acid. They call it an incorporeal niter spiritus mundi. It's weird because they describe it as being cold on the outside, but fire on the inside.
That cold fire idea again.
Yeah.
It's a central, even if it's a strange, part of this whole concept. And this spiritual niter. How does that turn into something more solid, something we can experience?
So as this spiritual niter gets closer to the atmospheres of planets and stars, it starts to become more material. And then when it hits this alkaline passive principle, it gets fixed and turns into what we know as native niter. It's like it goes from the spiritual spiritus mundi to a real physical substance.
And the sun's rays and sea salt have a role to play too, right?
Yeah, the sun's rays are seen as a kind of spiritual mundi, but very subtle. And as it gets closer to Earth, it becomes more and more nitrous. And the sea salt, they think it helps animate the atmosphere with fire or life.
It's all connected, this constant flow between the heavens and Earth.
Yeah.
And that movement is super important.
Absolutely. The constant rising of vapors, clouds, fogs, driven by the Earth's internal heat, then condensing and falling back down as rain, that, they say, is the very first matter of all things. Seems simple, but it's actually twofold. It has the active fire or spirit and the passive humidity or water.
So everything starts from and goes back to fire and water, or spirit mixed with humidity. That's the key, according to the golden chain of Omer, right?
That's the heart of chapter 2, yeah. If you understand that, you can start to see how things in nature change, how volatile things become fixed, and vice versa. It even suggests that you can make valuable things from simple materials because they all come from the same source. That's why, the text says, those who really wanted to understand nature, the philosophers, they looked for things where this universal spirit was really strong and easy to get at.
Makes sense. So we've got the basic elements, how they started. Chapter 3 moves on to how all things are further generated. Sounds like we're getting into the specifics of creation now.
Exactly. The book sets up this primordial vapor, the combo of fire and water, as the first matter. Then it explains how that vapor gets thicker, denser, they call it inspissated, into water. That water ferments because of the invisible spirit inside it. And that's how matter, in all its forms, is made.
So even the basic stuff of the world needs this spirit and fermentation.
Exactly. At first, that water is pure and subtle, but because of the spirit inside it, it becomes cloudy, starts to smell bad, and then forms earth. And there's like a hierarchy within the water. Spiritual, most subtle, less subtle, half corporeal, and finally, the physical body.
Going from the spirit to the physical, step by step. And there are 5 stages in this process, right?
Right. Simple humidity first, then water-containing spirit. Next, it separates into the volatile, the half-fixed, what they call a sedum and alkali, and the fixed, the corpus. Those basically represent anima, spirit, and body. Fourth stage is the familiar 4 elements: fire, air, water, earth. And last, the 5th stage, is when you make this indestructible fiery quintessence through art and nature working together.
The quintessence. That's a big deal in alchemy. What about putrefaction? Where does that fit in?
They say that when water reaches its term of putrefaction, it lets the subtle parts separate out in a specific order. The most volatile ones rise first, then the less volatile ones. It's like a natural distillation process because of the spirit inside the substance.
And then we get to this idea of a universal general sperm. That sounds like some kind of major life force for creating things.
It is. They believe that God made these different modifications of the universal spirit in the four elements to make this universal general sperm all the time. And to do that, each individual thing has an agent and a patient, an active and passive principle that interact to make change and generation happen. Like, think about evaporation. Things release their excess humidity. It's called influence when it comes from above, and effluvium when it comes from below.
So every individual thing has its own kind of sperm or creative power, but it's all under the control of this one big universal sperm.
Exactly. It's like there's a hierarchy with individual reproductive powers as part of this huge universal creative power.
Chapter 4 asks how the universal sperm is generated by the four elements. Sounds like we're getting into the nitty-gritty of how this creative process actually works.
Right. It goes back to that initial division of the anima, or spirit mundi, the primordial chaos, into the four elements: fire, air, water, earth. And they're told to increase and multiply. Heaven and air, animated by the universal fire, are considered the father, the male, the agent, the active force that shapes things. Water and earth are the mother, the female, the patient, the receptive force.
So cosmic marriage between these active and passive forces, and that creates everything.
Exactly. But the text is clear. These four really come down to just two: fire and water, and they have to constantly generate a regenerated chaotic water, or primordial chaos from their core. This is what drives the ongoing cycle of generation, preservation, destruction, and regeneration of everything until, some point of divine calcination.
And this process isn't easy because the elements seem to be against each other, right?
They do seem contrary, and that's why they can't just directly create things. It has to be orderly with mediation so they can effectively make this universal sperm and regenerate chaos. This leads to a very important idea they stress in the book: non transire posse ab uno extremo an alterum absque medio. It means you can't go from one extreme to another without a middle step.
A kind of bridge, a connection between things. They give examples like how fire needs air to become water and earth needs water to become air.
Right. You can't directly combine something as volatile as fire with something as fixed as earth. The volatile one will just revert back to its chaotic beginning. The most volatile always needs a medium to interact with the most fixed in all natural processes. Anyone doing alchemy or working with natural forces needs to keep this in mind.
So to connect fire and earth, you need those steps. Fire to air, air to water, water to earth. A gradual process.
Precisely. The elements have different degrees of subtlety. Fire is the most subtle, then air, then water, and finally earth, which is the most corporeal. Nature blends these subtleties gradually, and we have to follow that progression if we want to transform anything.
Like following a recipe carefully, step by step. They use that chemical anatomy analogy to explain it, right? Talking about extracting the salt from earth.
Yeah, you dissolve the earth in water, distill it, and repeat that process. It's called coabation. And eventually you're volatilizing the whole thing, turning it into the spiritual water. Basically, you're extracting the most refined parts of the earth. Nature does something similar when it makes the universal sperm through dissolution and coagulation.
So the key is to watch nature's slow and steady processes. Pay attention to time, weight, measure, and translate those physical processes into a deeper, more spiritual understanding.
Exactly. Understanding those rhythms and subtle transformations is the key to unlocking nature's secrets.
Now, Chapter 5 jumps in with the question: in what manner the divided chaotic water is regenerated and becomes the universal and general sperm of all things, called anima, or spiritus mundi.
Yeah.
That's a mouthful, but it sounds like we're finally getting to the heart of this universal life force.
We are. It starts by reminding us that the four elements, even though they look different, all come from one chaos. They have one basic form, fire, and one basic matter, water. The differences come from fermentation, with fire turning into air, then water, then earth.
But it's reversible, right? Fire can become earth and earth can go back to being fire.
Exactly. If not, the elements would be totally separate and unchanging. Their unity is because they come from fire and water. They just get differentiated through volatilization and thickening. They even point out how that primordial humidity becomes air because fire makes it thinner, and how earth was formed when humidity condensed with the fire turning inward. And get this, they say the hieroglyphs, the symbols for the elements, perfectly capture their nature.
And everything has those foundational things: universal fire and primordial humidity, right?
Yep. Whether it's liquid or solid, everything has that universal fire, what they also call innate heat, and that primordial humidity, also called radical humidity. And that universal fire can become external humidity, but it's still inside as a spiritual, volatile, and active force. It drives warmth and fermentation, and that creates this universal vinegar.
That universal vinegar keeps popping up. It seems pretty important in all this.
It is. When it finds the right material, either in water or earth, the universal sperm becomes visible and physical. But when it's just vapor in the atmosphere, it's like an incorporeal astral sperm, the influence from heaven that comes through the air.
So we've got this constant interplay between the heavens and earth, and that's what creates and sustains this life force.
Exactly. Heaven, air, water, and earth, they all work together to make the universal sperm of the world.
Chapter 6 then moves on to of the heavens and their influence. We're going cosmic now.
Right. Heaven, which became visible as light after chaos was separated, is seen as the first, most subtle, the highest, and the most universal principle. It creates humidity that becomes a super volatile and pure vapor way up in the highest celestial sphere, far from other planets and stars.
Heaven is like the ultimate source, the beginning of everything. And it's incredibly active, right?
Absolutely. It's full of life, the most active principle. That's why they call it the first agent, the male sperm, the soul. It's even described as a subtle air, a subtle water, and a volatile earth. Pretty multifaceted.
And its influence flows down to the more material stuff below.
Right. Heaven and air affect water and earth, while earth and water rise up to meet them. They mix together as vapors and create what they call chaotic, regenerated, or impregnated, water the universal, semi-material sperma mundi. As soon as air is impregnated by heaven, it passes that influence on to both water and earth.
It's like breathing in and out, but on a cosmic scale.
Uh,
And the atmosphere is key for that communication between heaven and earth.
totally. The atmosphere is always full of vapors, exhalations, and clouds, and that allows the elements to communicate. When those vapors condense and fall down as rain, dew, snow, hail at the same time, stuff is volatilizing and exhaling from the water and earth to meet it. That keeps the cycle going, creating more vapors, and those, when they expand enough, become our air. And how pure that air is depends on how much it's animated by heaven or fire.
So the heavens aren't just sitting up there doing nothing. They're actively involved in what's happening here on earth through this exchange of vapors and influences.
Exactly. The heavens take in the rising vapors, and as those vapors move away from Earth, they become more subtle and spiritual, eventually returning to that universal state, the ether or spiritus mundi. The air is constantly receiving volatilized water and other vapors until it's full, and then that excess comes down as precipitation. Fire and air get into the waters, giving them their qualities, and then the water drops off its heavier parts onto the earth. That excess earth and water is then volatilized back up as vapors by the Earth's internal heat, and the cycle continues.
It's a beautiful system of interconnectedness. And the driving force behind it all is the universal fire's attraction and repulsion powers.
Exactly. God built that perpetual cycle into the universal fire, making it the main agent, the driving force of nature. Or you could say nature itself in its active form. The book uses a great analogy to explain this. Think about how we eat food and what happens to the waste. The byproducts of one thing become food for something else.
Like leaves decomposing and fertilizing the soil, which then feeds the tree. A perfect example of how everything's connected. And doesn't this idea connect to those old Hermetic and Platonic ideas about a chain or ring that connects everything?
Yeah, the Superius and Inferius of Hermes, the Catena Homeri, or the Platonic ring. They're all symbols of this constant transformation of matter, changes in form, while the central fire of nature stays the same, just like it was in the beginning. And don't forget, everything starts as water and ultimately goes back to water. That's the cycle.
Chapter 7 zooms in on of the atmosphere or air and its influence. We're getting closer to home.
Right. Air, what they call genuine animated air, is the second big principle after chaos is separated. It acts as the vehicle, the tool for fire, the first principle. Air is considered male, manly, sperm, and the primary operator of everything.
So fire is the animating soul, and air is the one that makes things happen in the world.
Great way to put it. Heaven or fire is the anima and life, while air, as rarefied humidity, is the spirit, the container for the soul, the principle of life. So animated fire is what they call spiritus vitalis macrocosmi, the vital spirit of our cosmos. Air is defined as this subtle, humid vapor or rarefied water that's full of fire. This makes it more physical than the ether that's way out there beyond our atmosphere. That ether is too subtle for us to breathe.
So air is like the middleman, able to work with both the fire and the water aspects of creation.
Exactly. It's the link between fire and water, receiving influences from both the heavens above and the earth below. It's constantly moving, circulating, and turning more and more vapor into air, animating it with fire. And when it gets full, saturated, that extra humidity falls back down as animated water, rain, dew, hail, snow.
It's like a cosmic rainmaker. Air is the main thing that brings together fire, water, and earth.
Exactly. It's a transformer, changing into vapor, water. Earth, on the other hand, becomes more subtle or volatilized with the help of water and can be turned back into air. These constant changes between extremes happening within the vapors make the universal sperm of the world the spiritus mundi. Some of that becomes precipitation, and some stays in the air to keep things animated. Then that animated water falls on the earth, which is seen as the receiver of all the good stuff from the heavens. That's how it gets fertilized for animals, plants, minerals, all life.
And the elements are in constant flux, right? Earth is condensed, heaven is volatilized earth, air is rarefied water, and water is condensed air. It's a never-ending dance of transformations.
Yeah, the difference between the elements is just how volatile or fixed they are, how fluid or condensed. But deep down, they're all still prima materia, which is fire. They even compare air to the kidneys of the macrocosm, the place where all those cosmic fluids and the pure essence of the world meet. That's where the primordial chaos is regenerated every day.
So rain, dew, snow, hail. It's not just weather. It's like regenerated chaos coming down, giving life and food to everything. And it all happens thanks to the air.
Exactly. It's a whole different way of looking at the atmosphere, more profound than just the air we breathe.
Chapter 8 shifts gears a bit, focusing on of water and its effluvium. Time to talk about the life-giving element.
Right. It starts by reminding us how connected water and earth and fire and air are. They all need each other. Earth needs water, fire needs air. Air without fire goes bad, becomes putrid humidity, and water without animated air just becomes stagnant mud and earth.
So balance is key, and water is super important in this balance.
Absolutely. Water is the third principle, the first passive element, the female sperm and menstruum of the macrocosm. It brings nourishment to all things. Along with earth, it's the mother of all things. It's described as condensed air and fluid earth, and it acts as the middleman between air and earth.
It's like the nurturing, receptive force of creation. How does it interact with the other elements in this big creative process?
So when fire becomes air and air condenses into water rain, that water falls onto the grosser waters and earth. They mix, and the primordial spirit, the fire within, starts the fermentation process. This interaction leads to one element acting on another, and eventually they produce their fruits, the products of creation from the proper wombs or matrices.
And they tell the artist, the alchemist or natural philosopher, to learn from nature.
Right. Nature uses both air and water to change fire into earth, and the alchemist should follow that lead, find the right mediums to bring things together, especially homogeneous mediums. If one isn't enough, maybe you need two, even three.
It's all about watching and learning from nature. And the text brings back the idea that the differences between minerals, plants, and animals are just on the surface.
Yes, they all come from the same universal spirit. Minerals are like fixed plants, and plants are like volatile minerals. They can be transmuted, their inner qualities changed.
And they give that really interesting example of transmutation, that whole cycle of life and death
Right.
with humans, animals, plants.
Yeah, plants become food for humans and animals, turning into flesh and blood. When we die and are buried, we decompose and then plants grow again, taking up mineral vapors through their roots, basically turning those minerals back into plant matter. They called it the true Pythagorean metempsychosis, a constant cycle of transformation. Plants that decay become nitrous and saline, get dissolved by rain, carried into the earth and sea, then come back up as mineral vapor and become plants again. Sometimes even animals. Heaven and air are the male sperm, water is the female sperm and menstruum, and earth is the womb where everything happens.
Okay, chapter 9 is of the earth and its effluvium, wrapping up our tour of the four elements.
Right. Earth is presented as the fourth and final principle of chaos, the second passive element, the matrix, the mother. It's coagulated, fixed heaven and water, condensed air. It's where everything comes together, where the celestial influences take root, in the earth itself and the ocean.
So earth is the grounding force, and it's connected to heaven's constant motion, even though it seems still.
Exactly. Heaven is super subtle, the most mobile and omnipresent elements, always moving, even if we can't see it. That movement creates light, and is the cause of all motion in nature. It sets the air in motion way up in the atmosphere, which then moves the clouds and vapors. And that motion gets slower as you get closer to the Earth because the air gets denser.
It's like a cascade of motion, from the subtle to the tangible. And they give us examples of how this works in the real world, right?
Yeah, the fact that the atmosphere is always moving shows us that air is moved by ether or fire. Ships sailing on water show us that air moves water. And the way water moves sand, mud, stones shows us that water moves earth. Every time something moves, they say, it's because of the warmth of the omnipresent but cold universal fire. Sometimes we can see that warmth like in animals, sometimes not, like in plants and minerals. All life comes from the motion of this universal fire. If it stops, life ends. This leads to the idea that every element has this innate heat. Sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't, and it's not just because of the sun or the Earth's internal heat.
So even things that seem lifeless actually have this inner vitality, this movement from the universal fire.
Right. Heaven never stops working. It has these invisible powers, even in things that seem inactive, like a plant that's been cut or a piece of ore. They still have medicinal properties because of the heaven within them. The text says that the power of concrete things we can touch comes from the implanted heaven, its internal and external motion and warmth. Everything contains heaven, air, water, and earth because they all come from the primeval chaos, which was fire and humidity, with fire as the mover.
And this fire, or spirit, is everywhere, even in the tiniest pieces of matter. So what makes things different from each other if they all have this fire inside?
The difference is how volatile or fixed they are, how easily they change. That's what accounts for all the variety in the world. And nature's goal is to make heaven physical, to fix it so it becomes useful. To do that, it needs vapors, air, and water to act as go-betweens so heaven can interact with earth. God designed it so that heaven would become corporeal, change into all the elements, and the less refined elements would become more subtle, turning into air, fire, or heaven, so they could be re-energized by celestial influences.
What about vapors? They seem pretty important in this back and forth between heaven and earth.
They are. The earth has its own internal heat, strongest at its core. That heat causes a constant transpiration and sublimation, creating vapors, dews, and fogs. These vapors are twofold water and earth, and also fourfold, containing all four elements that need each other. The water and earth in these vapors are already somewhat refined and get even more subtle as they rise, turning into air and fire, or heaven.
So it's a constant refining and condensing, each element playing its part in changing the others.
Exactly. Fire refines air, air refines water, water refines and softens earth. And going the other way, earth condenses water, water condenses air, and air condenses and makes heaven, or fire, more physical, turning air into spiritus mundi. Each element acts as a magnet, a solvent, a volatilizer, a condenser, a coagulator, and a fixer for the others. And their volatility and fixity changes depending on how close or far they are from each other, like fire near the atmosphere versus fire further away, or surface water versus deep water. Things that are closer together mix and become more physical faster.
It's a dynamic system, always changing, influencing each other. And it all starts with those primordial vapors.
Yep. The four elements come from those primordial vapors, and they have to keep making more vapor, which nature then turns into that chaotic water that falls as rain. That rain contains the universal sperm, even though we can't see it. This sets the stage for the next chapter, where we learn about the power of this regenerated chaos.
Chapter 10 is called Discovery of the Genuine Universal Sperm in the Regenerated Chaos, the corporified animal, or spiritus mundi. Sounds like a big reveal.
It is. They've already explained how fire, water, air, earth come from chaotic waters and how they create and regenerate this universal sperm in the chaotic waters. Now, they're going to tell us exactly what this universal sperm is. They say it's made when vapors in the atmosphere are circulated and evaporated, kind of like in a big alembic of the air, until they're full of fire. Then they condense back into water, dew, rain, showers, hail, snow.
So all those kinds of precipitation are this universal sperm. That's pretty amazing.
That's what they're saying. It's the true regenerated chaos, animated by the real spiritus mundi, the Anima Mundi. This is what creates, preserves, destroys, and regenerates everything on Earth, according to their original forms. And they say that this Anima Mundi is really just nature itself in its most potent form.
And the chapter sets out to prove that this precipitation actually is regenerated chaos, containing that universal sperm and spirit mundi.
Right. They say that because these forms of precipitation came from the original chaos and contain all four elements, they must have all the power of those elements in a combined form. And there's a fundamental truth. Everything goes back to where it came from. Elements that came from vapor and fire will go back to vapor and fire. Elements that came from fire and humidity will return through fire and humidity.
And the evidence is both what we see dew and rain doing and what they're made of chemically.
Exactly. They have huge effects on plants, animals need them to live, and they're involved in how minerals and metals are made. Plus, chemical analysis shows they contain all four elements.
And then they give us this experiment so we can actually see this regeneration of chaos for
I
ourselves.
do. They say to collect rainwater, preferably from a thunderstorm, filter out any impurities, and then put it in a warm, dark place covered with a clean cloth for about a month. Over that time, you'll see changes. It warms up, starts to ferment and putrefy, gets cloudy, and starts to smell. A brown, spongy earth will rise to the top and then sink to the bottom. That's the separation of the gross parts from the refined parts by the spirit that's working inside it.
And they call that slimy brown earth the universal gur of nature.